Good evening, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, or I guess this evening, and welcome to our WISC CALS University of Calgary webinar on advanced transportation, discussing trucking and technology. My name is Cindy Clark, and I am the CEO of the WISC Association. And the WISC Association was founded as an initiative born under the Asia Pacific Gateway Accelerator Project in 2012. The WISC Association's goal is to remove silos which exist within the industries which make up the supply chain, to elevate and acknowledge all professionals and professions within the supply chain, and bring all professions together to work together to create, grow, and support the significance of all the industries within the supply chain. Before we move into the presentation, I'd like to encourage the attendee participation. Please submit any of your questions for the speakers throughout the webinar or during our break. If you have any questions that you'd like to submit, use the Q&A submission on the Zoom that you'll see on your panel. And please include your name and company and supply chain sector you represent if you would. Participant questions will be reviewed and then answered during the second portion of the webinar, or as the panelists receive the questions to see if they can facilitate the presentation. Joining me to moderate this afternoon's discussion is Dr. Giovanni de Silveira, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management, Haskayne School of Business from the University of Calgary. Hello, Giovanni. How are you?
I'm good, Cynthia. Hello. Hello, everyone.
Great. Yeah. Giovanni, if you could introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Giovanni da Silveira. As Cynthia indicated, I'm professor at the Haskayne School of Business, and also director of the Canadian Center for Advanced Supply Chain Management and Logistics. So our center aims to develop and disseminate world-class knowledge on supply chain management and logistics through education, research, and community engagement activities like this one.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
So I'd like to thank you again for the guests who are just joining our room. We have many guests registered today, including people from the corporate community and students.
Great. I'm now honored to introduce our presenters for the day. Joining us is Jacob Lamb, Urban Goods Delivery Research and Civil Engineer, PhD candidate from the University of Calgary. His thesis concerns the planning of future autonomous urban goods delivery systems with the aim to encourage sustainable business practices and government policy towards this goal. He has presented his work in Hong Kong, China, Ottawa, and locally in Calgary to municipal transportation planners at the City of Calgary. Next, I'd like to welcome Jude Groves, Director of Safety and Training, Executive Leader at Rosenau Transport, and he's also the current Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Alberta Motor Transportation Association. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you doing this evening?
Good, thanks, Cindy.
Very
well, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. Reminder, the webinar should take about 90 minutes, which includes presentations and Q&A. Questions can be posted at any time and will be answered as best as possible. If anybody has questions that they'd like to have as a follow-up, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If questions that you are interested in have already been posted, you can upload it. There is also a chat facility that can be addressed to specific participants or to the entire room. Without further ado, let's hear from Jacob, who's going to start with his presentation.
Hey, thank you, Cindy, for that introduction, and hello, everybody. As said, yeah, my name's Jacob. You can tell by my accent, I'm from Scotland. I'm a current PhD student in the Integrated Infrastructure for Sustainable Cities program in the Civil Engineering Department of the Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary. Very happy to be invited here to talk today. Previously, I've worked as a bridge inspector and a roadway engineer, as well as an oil and gas intern in Aberdeen. So that's why I have my civil engineer proudly displayed on LinkedIn. And now I'm very excited to be working on this kind of new developing field of last mile autonomous delivery. So I'd like to begin by turning the presentation a little bit on its head, that in case you drop connection, you can take these 4 messages home. We're all here to talk about and understand these new technologies. You might have heard about autonomous trucking. That's probably the thrust of this presentation. And I'm here to tell you that these technologies are real and they're not far off, and that you really need to ignore them at your peril. However, that second point, they're not everything. They'll come in sections, because computers and these autonomous technologies are great at what they're programmed to do, but not much else. And no amount of kind of machine learning, we're quite far off from that golden silver bullet. Autonomous platooning trucks are great, but they're not going to deliver things direct to your home. This is quite a holistic whole supply chain solution that needs to be addressed. This leads into my kind of third point of the presentation, that this is the biggest barrier I see to this technology, that it's addressing specific sections. And these newcomers and people providing this new technology sometimes don't see that. So the logistic systems are truly interconnected and multimodal. And you need to be careful that bringing in new technology does benefit areas of your system that are experiencing a bottleneck. So it doesn't make sense to bring in extra truck capacity with the form of platooning, for example, if that area already has excess capacity. This interconnectedness of the supply chain is an area that my specific corner of academia still struggles to understand the multi-echelon nature of the business. And it's also where then, human intuition and, your experience in your industry can really still be incredibly invaluable. For instance, last mile operations that I do are really easy to quantify the savings of it, but more complex studies are needed to then understand the kind of inter-echelon relationships between transportation and inventory, for example. Finally, the fourth point, you might not need this new technology to still make improvements that are being seen and understood because of the deployment of this new technology. These technologies are trying to overcome barriers to efficient operations, but they're still bound by the laws of physics and economics, just like any regular old truck. So you can overcome these challenges, sometimes through clever and unique negotiation with stakeholders and coming to different understandings about everyone's perspectives and different costs and new and interesting agreements without needing that new technology and sidestepping the problem that technology was trying to address in the first place. This is in part a barrier to the very entry of these technologies. As more research goes into the challenges, many times people are realizing they can overcome that problem with a less risky and more often proven solution. So to get back into a more regular presentation style, this is my presentation structure, where I'll be talking about for the next 15 minutes. I'll be going from left to right, talking about the silos, each stage of the freight journey independently, what I call consolidation, distribution, and last mile. My area of specific expertise is here in the far future and near present last mile technology. I believe this sector is currently the bottleneck for the system capacity, and thus is kind of most rife for the innovation in the next 10 years. Within each of the stages, I will talk briefly about the past technologies that will still then be here in the present, as well as some interesting near future technologies, and then some maybe farther future technologies. They'll be color coded, as you can see on the screen. And I'd like to note that this is quite a simplified model, but I'm hoping it goes to show the state of the operations research and the niches that these technologies are trying to fill. And it also goes to show that interdependent and transfer-heavy intermodal nature of freight. And that in most cases for transportation, although I'm a transportation engineer, I do work to understand the other parts of the supply chain that make it so complicated and dynamic. The repacking and planning, the sorting and financial decisions and investment that really make this industry complex. Those sort of issues mean that things that may benefit one link in this chain can detrimentally affect all the others in unforeseen ways. And that's what I believe companies know and transportation logistics service providers know. And it's another reason that there's a barrier to this new technology, because there's such a high barrier and high proven cost that you need to really prove new technologies quite rigorously for them to be adopted. So let's first look at what I call the consolidation stage, how industry takes things from factories to an owner's warehouse, or how things are received from overseas or cross borders, typically of ranges over 1,000 kilometers. For this, over the last many decades, it's been the big four contenders, with only minor shifts in the mode share between trains, trucks, ships, and planes. And I cheekily want to say it wouldn't be an Albertan presentation without mentioning pipelines, which really are the black sheep of the family, but are still an incredibly efficient way of moving liquid and gas commodities that are not thought of traditionally in supply chains. It's well known that the type of good you're looking to ship typically dominates your decision about which mode you'll be choosing. Valuable goods are sent by air, bulk goods are sent by train, and everything in the middle seems to be sent by truck. This is also partly driven by customers' different business values, and these two reasons are why we have such variety in this modes section. I'm sure you know quite well why your customers choose your service and who their alternatives are for that, and thus who your competitors are. But on a purely logical side and purely academic side, the difference between these modes is characterized by the speed, their cost, cost per kilogram, and the frequency of the departures, with each mode having its own separate niche. Things like IT and communications might alleviate customer anxiety, but it doesn't do much to change these fundamental physical logistic characteristics. Further than as a civil engineer, I think these are really good examples because they require so much infrastructure to enable the bulk modes that we see, things like rail and what we sometimes don't consider even trucks that require an awful lot of infrastructure in the form of rails and highways to work, that the higher cost modes of transportation typically have a higher unit cost mode of transportation has a lower investment cost. This has been true for the last 100 years and for this stage. This means that as a civil engineer and supply chain professionals, we really are kind of standing on the shoulders of giants and what they've built here, this kind of delicate house of cards a little bit. And it should be remembered as a lesson for moving forward into the adoption of new technologies. So that biggest technology that's in mind for the audience here are driverless trucking. And that's what I'm going to talk about first. We all know that there's a driver shortage, and we can probably name a few companies that are giving this technology a go, but is it really realistic? And what are the other kind of unforeseen barriers to this? Well, again, as putting my civil engineering hat on, I can tell you there are many conferences that discuss the difficulties with highway bridges, that are going to be needed to be checked for this new load pattern, because platooning trucks in particular, where for the first 5 to 10 years, we're putting different loads patterns on bridges. And having worked in a bridge inspection department for government before, I can tell you that's going to be a slow process to check all of these thousands and thousands of bridges across the country. Furthermore, what sort of infrastructure do we think will be needed to be embedded into the road to accommodate this new technology for the trucks? Well, there are many competing systems. Some in Europe do rely on inbuilt sensors in the road, or, for example, expansive 5G networks. And this is great because it reduces the cost of individual trucks having less onboard technology, which is a good thing for the trucking industry. However, more impatient companies that are not willing to wait for these checks and these infrastructures are willing to invest the time and the money to be able to make independent trucking systems that won't require that, which are more expensive on a per unit basis. So these trailblazers aren't willing to wait, and they might end up pricing people out of the market as they start to realize the cost savings, kind of shown at the bottom of that figure shown. Further, this is all great for costs and labor shortages, but doesn't really do anything to address fuel usage. So the autonomous vehicle trucking technology might drive a little bit better, but it's still going to guzzle a lot of gas. And to be honest, Alberta's current electrical grid isn't much better because it emits a lot of CO2 through the coal stations used to provide that electricity. So environmentally conscious companies or people out there might want to consider alternative fuels such as hydrogen if you're wanting to be energy conscious. And then finally, for the third stage of this diagram, in the 2025 to 2027, as predicted by McKinsey here, autonomous vehicle trucks will be constrained to highways and be requiring large staging areas outside of a city to be able to facilitate a cross-command operation where drivers take over for the city portion of a trip. This will drive larger warehouses and new warehouses even further outside of the city. And I can think of examples such as the new Balzac Amazon facility in the north of Calgary as an example. This all realized, though, that the hope of this industry is that we're going to be realizing up to 45% total cost to own savings and potentials of environmental savings as well. Now, with that blue color in the background, this is the far-fetched future potential of cargo pipelines, not just oil and gas pipelines. Unit costs of these freight systems will be much lower than even platooning AV trucks and won't be disrupted by traffic. And it's not quite as far-fetched as you might think. There are a couple of studies on the bottom there, some academic references that have investigated this solution to some niche markets, such as near airports that have particularly high congestion. For a credible example, for a real-world example, the video on screen is from the Chinese Amazon equivalent, which is actually 5 times greater than the size of Amazon in its fulfillment capacity, called JD.com. They're hoping to have underground tunnels that connect their production and warehousing centers to avoid these highways, congested highways, which is really a similar strategy and rationale behind Amazon's expansion in the US to air freight with Amazon Air Prime. If you didn't already know, Amazon owns over 50 aircraft that they've all bought in the last 5 years. And this is to control their brand and supply chain. So my personal theory then is from the outfall from this pandemic, with the uncertainty in supply chains becoming more and more apparent, these mega corporations are going to accelerate that investment into their supply chain, looking to become their own service providers, turning what was once a customer into a competitor.
So, Jacob, can I ask a question here?
Yes, absolutely.
Because, I mean, just on the previous slide, you're talking about the autonomous trucks. And I believe that, at least on a theoretical basis, we've known this technology, the promise of autonomous trucks for many, many years now. And by looking at the McKinsey forecast that you presented us, it seems that this technology is is only a few years away. You know, I wonder to what extent this prediction would be accurate for, let's say, our local roads here in Alberta or in Canada. How far away are we from really those trucks on our roads, and what people are missing to get there? What investments or changes in structure or regulations would be necessary to make sure to allow this technology to finally happen in our vicinity here?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Giovanni. Thank you. This study from McKinsey was quite US-centric, and their optimistic view of their 2018 to 20, seeing the drivers in each truck, then to 2022, a driver in a leading truck. That's the platooning they're talking about. The main issue for the platooning is, as I've said, the infrastructure. I think in Canada, there's also issues with frost and temperature issues. And there are many kind of weigh stations, which we're all familiar with. These might all have to be changed, and things such as the platooning, they'll have to have new regulations and new standards to hold by. And that's going to be a lot of work from civil engineers checking those infrastructure systems. Kind of moving into that constrained autonomy and full autonomy at the end, there are working prototypes that have shown this technology to be proven in the US. And my theory is that the US roads are very similar to the Canadian ones. So in theory, they will work. However, Canada does have much more difficult road driving conditions, shall I say, and things such as snow really do cause havoc for these systems. So I would add at least 2 to 3, maybe more years onto the McKinsey's prediction for Canada and Alberta.
And are there, because I think if you're not used to these technologies, are there any really exceptional safety risks here that have not been resolved yet? So what are the risks of having autonomous trucks in our roads? How can we eliminate those risks in terms of safety?
Yeah, for trucking, this is why with trucking they're looking at highways because the risk is already significantly reduced. That full autonomy is given 2027 plus for a reason, because the identification of kind of vulnerable road users is an incredibly difficult challenge. For example, bicycle users, I think about 70%, some unfortunate percentage of people are injured with trucks because of blind spots, for example. This might be improved by technology, but there's something in my head that I've been told before that, you know, if you've got an autonomous technology, that is almost by default going to be improved by making that autonomous instead of autonomous, making it a driver assisting technology. So a lot of these problems can be addressed by making driver assist services, and that can be combined into trucking, and we might see some combined modes like that in the constrained autonomy that might, you know, merge the best of both.
Okay, and just a third question we just got here from Brandon Choi before we move. I'd let you move on. So what are the costs? I imagine that Brandon's mentioned the investment costs for a transportation company to have those trucks on, and the likelihood, feasibility that, again, perhaps looking at our environment here, that this will be actually adopted. Suppose that the technology is available. I understand that that's what Brandon is coming from. Technology being available, but it's still, what's the likelihood that our companies here would be adopting those technologies? What cost?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I think it would be really up to individual companies to look at that cost benefit analysis and integrating it with their larger systems. You know, thinking about the connectedness of your supply chain. If you're, yeah, the easy answer, I suppose, is that it's cost that you're hoping to reduce your driver costs. But if that is not offset by, if that's offset too much by a large investment into the cost of technology, you know, as I've said, with there's so much onboard systems, then that's going to be a hard sell for an individual company to make. I believe part of that question was the kind of infrastructure changes that might need to be made, or other sorts of changes to actually accommodate that.
Yeah, I think that's part of the question. Not in the component.
I think that's an interesting question that I'd have to get back to that, the question asker with. I'm sure there'll be interesting small changes that will be needed to be required with kind of the loading yards and dockings for that. And I think that's why you're going to see a lot of constrained autonomy or platooning for a long time, that the cab of the truck is always going to be there, because you're always going to need that human to do that last 50 feet or so maneuvering.
Okay, Jacob, I think I let you move on. Maybe later we can come back. There's a follow-up question from Brando, but we can come back to this point later on. Please move.
I'd also like to defer some of the truck questions to Jude, who's the real resident expert on our panel. It'll be interesting to get his perspectives on this in the Q&A session.
Yes.
So yes, back to the presentation here. So some of one of the ideas I've shown is quite eye in the sky, but I'd like to take a moment to just reflect on kind of some of those fundamental logistic facts again, but also show how long it took to get there. That the scale and efficiencies of these long-haul flights, ships, and trucks wouldn't be possible without the container ships and pallets, which standardize transfer in the intermodal terminals. It famously took cargo ship loading from 2 weeks to about 2 days. But this didn't happen quickly. It took literally a world war and military logistics challenges before these became standardized in the 50s and 60s. And today there are still multiple competing standards for many of these technologies, for the pallets, for example. So if I'm kind of projecting this into the future, I'm imagining that regulations for things such as the common carrying, for last mile technology, or common standards for autonomous trucking and vans might take similarly long, in the region of 40 years for these technologies. And this reflection also then led me to think about, are some of the new encroaching people into this market going backwards and forgetting some of these tried and tested lessons? That in a rush to meet demand for the speedier delivery, there are cross-modal phases like shown on the screen, and surely it isn't shown on the screen as a sustainable way to do things. So this goes to show that the details matter for these interconnections, my third point in my second slide, to keep in mind your interconnected nature of the business, and that simply plugging in some fancy new technology isn't necessarily going to work if it's transferring costs into a different sector of your supply chain, and that keeping in mind and trying to ease the interconnected and intermodal nature with a little bit of patience and thinking will enable the best efficiencies to happen. So the next stage, which I like to call distribution, is how you get from the rail yard or to the store, or how you get from the port to an inland warehouse. It's the middle child stage and has nearly exclusively been met by trucks in the past. Transport Canada shows that 90% of domestic freight in Canada was conducted by a truck. That's about 66 million trips, and that these trips were on average only about 600 kilometers long, as opposed to over 2,200 for rail and air. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, I'm sure. Looking into the future now, this is what I mean, but technology will be deployed in specific sectors. That's the truck shown on screen, this autonomous vehicle by Gatik, a panelist of a recent other presentation I was watching, described their business model as focusing exclusively on the middle mile. And these vehicles currently are a little bit slow, as regulations mandate, and they have a safety driver in them. But these are the sort of technology that I mean, that they don't require infrastructure embedded into the road. So they'll become much more flexible once these regulations are restricted and they've been shown to be proven. Gatik isn't the only developer in this space. There's another one on screen I've shown called Boxbot. And this company in particular are looking at slightly shorter trips in the urban fringe. Then finally into the far future, with the kind of technology proven, the safety driver can be removed and this space of the cab can be used for extra cargo space and even have some strange and more different designs we might not have expected. So that moves us into the last mile space, my own particular area of expertise, which is all about getting items from the store or from a warehouse to customers. I think that the last mile is currently the most dynamic and fast changing environment, especially given the pandemic. However, in the past, if we think about that, if I'm going to keep on that train, these intercity or intertown trips were conducted by a man in his van kind of shown, or simply a boy on his bike. What's caused these technologies to then go away and be focused exclusively onto trucks is the fact that warehouses have been pushed to the urban edges, spurred by rising land costs and urban sprawl, as you can see in this center image of the map with the Amazon facility, some 7 kilometers by road away from the nearest suburb homes. This is meaning that people on bicycle are unable to deliver things from this facility into the city, and even some electric vehicle designs are struggling, which means we're having an over-reliance on traditional kind of internal combustion trucks and having issues like we're seeing on screen. But because of the high turnover rate of the vehicles, because they're so highly utilized in a start-stop manner, and the high cost of this last stage, it's been quoted to be 25% of the total logistics cost. This area is really ripe for that disruption and innovation, and much of my field has been interested in testing simulations and theoretical applications of new technologies. So that's this final strip on the bottom I'm talking about. Here we can see a drone system that will be working in conjunction with a truck. The idea that it can take some of the burden off of a truck trip, reducing the carbon emissions and the fuel required, and hopefully increasing the capacity of that truck. The center video shows a simulation study where drones are performing a similar operation, except they're using regularly scheduled bus trips throughout a city to piggyback rides on. And this is a company called Starship, who are using a Mercedes van in conjunction with them to deliver packages to suburban sites using this joint system. All of these are trying to lower the per unit and per delivery cost of the last mile, and there have been several academic studies, well, dozens really, showing the various efficiencies if they're to be believed. But as I said before, the challenges that these technologies are trying to overcome really have a simple cause. It's because the warehouse is too far out of the city. And this is giving rise to urban consolidation centers being rise in interest, warehouse in the city, so that the traditional technologies or cargo bikes can be used and electric vehicles can be more easily used. This has given rise then to a new research area called the final 50 feet. Simply, how does that robot land in your yard or climb your steps, like in the blue box shown? This stage has always been there, but it's been hidden because delivery drivers have just intuitively known what to do. However, as we can see in the left-hand image, sometimes in a highly congested space, that produces less than desirable results, such as blocking a bus-only lane. Research has now gone to show that delivery drivers in dense urban areas can spend up to 15 minutes simply looking for a parking space because of the inadequate commercial parking being provided in most cities. There's then the difficulty on unloading in the urban streets and navigating commercial buildings to their final drop-off point, taking up to another 20 minutes. This is clearly a waste of drivers who are in short supply. Some studies, some in Seattle, for example, have shown that common carrier lockers can reduce this drop-off time by 80%, leaving more time for deliveries and supporting evidence for municipalities to invest in common carrying common lockers. Lessons can be learned from this to then be transferred to other stages of the logistics chain. So, in summary, I'll return to my points I talked about at the start. These technologies could have helped in the current pandemic due to their contactless nature and increased capacity. So that's why they're coming, and people have a vested interest in making sure they get to market. Last mile is particularly obvious in this way because customers will feel better about their package security, but it's also important that it will be permeating the warehousing space and other parts of the supply chain. Secondly, the supply chain is long and diverse, not particularly what technology excels in. Technology will find a way to overcome the lack of infrastructure support, but it might not always be the best long-term solution. And it might be too late to justify the investment into infrastructure once an independent technology arrives that does not require it, resulting in a suboptimal solution. Automation and connectivity can make leaps and bounds in one area, but might stagnate in others. Third point, this is why it's important to remember the intermodal nature of the business, that as managers or as people in the industry, that your supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and in adding new technology in one area might not help unless you can adjust to take advantage of it. Furthermore, it could be a threat area for smaller businesses where larger players are moving to take and implement their own standards. And as I've shown, standards can take quite some time to implement. Whereas I think regulation can help, healthy regulation can help healthy competition, such as common carrier practices, such as the palletization and container ships. Finally, reflecting on the challenges thrown up by the trailblazing technology, sometimes the answer is just practice or policy. It's often a hidden cost that one stakeholder is inadvertently causing another. For example, why do we need cargo bikes? Well, because the van parking is too hard to find. Why doesn't the municipality just provide some more parking spaces? Why do we need the vans in the first place? Well, because the land use policy prioritizes residential neighborhoods and we have incredibly high land costs. Why not have more commercial zones inside of cities? Why do we need autonomous trucks? Well, because the railways have a monopoly on the line and are difficult to expand. All of these questions are an incredibly complicated web with many stakeholders, and it's important to consider that. So I'd just like to say thanks to many of to my committee, to inspiring academics in this field, my colleagues, and a special mention to Madri, who is my contact in the city, who did a lot for the urban goods, for the Calgary goods movement strategy.
Thank you very much, Jacob. That was fantastic. Shout out to Madri. I've been trying to connect with her myself, so that's great to mention her. She does have quite a passion when it comes to the goods movement in the city of Calgary. No, that's fantastic. What we're going to do is, because of timing, we are now going to move forward and have Jude begin his presentation, and we will then move forward on Q&A after a short break. But I will let you put your share up there, Jude, and we're ready to go. Thank you. That was fantastic, Jacob. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cindy. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jude Groves. I'm Director of Safety and Training at Rosenau Transport and the Chair of the Board for the Alberta Motor Transport Association. The focus really is on a snapshot of where we are today and a viable vision for future of commercial transportation through this disruption phase that's on our doorstep. I'm going to start with a brief video.
Many benefits of digital advances, they have to do more than just buy the latest tech. Digital leaders also stand out because of how they put it to and how they integrate digital tools into employees' day-to-day tasks. A recent study looked at 27 indicators of digitization across industries and grouped them into these three broad categories of digital assets, digital usage, and digital workers. It's no surprise that the IT and media industries lead the way, along with some other knowledge-intensive sectors that are highly digitized across all or most dimensions. They have the technology, they use it to interact with their customers and process transactions, and most importantly, their employees use it to work more efficiently. But most other sectors show significant room for improvement. Capital-intensive sectors such as utilities, basic manufacturing, and real estate have the potential to improve productivity by further digitizing their physical assets. While this has been happening gradually since the 1960s, the emergence of the Internet of Things is introducing new opportunities here. There is also some overlap between these and other B2B sectors like wholesale, which could improve interactions by engaging with customers digitally. Meanwhile, B2C sectors like education, healthcare, and construction could also benefit from digitizing their customer transactions. Lagging behind the rest are the quasi-public and highly localized sectors, the companies that are struggling with digitization across every category. Even the ones with access to great digital assets, such as the advanced diagnostic tools used in healthcare, struggle to bring digitization to other parts of the sector, customer transactions, for example. But surprisingly, the area where the most sectors are lacking is in providing digital tools to their workforce. An analysis of over 12,000 detailed task descriptions revealed that technology is yet to penetrate the day-to-day work of most Americans, and many companies are still stuck in the habit of keeping their few digitized tasks in a separate department. The good news is, if they can close this gap, the upside is huge, and all sectors could see major improvements in innovation, productivity, and profits.
So the interesting piece about the presentation and the material within is the only piece around transportation is related to customer interaction. So a quick focus on trucking, and this slide is focused on what COVID taught us. You know, looking back, the necessity of a resilient supply chain, challenges with offshore suppliers, international interprovincial restrictions, you know, and the fact that our lives are in crisis. Look back in the last few years and take note of the number of times where somewhere in North America we didn't have a crisis on our hands, and the fact that those short-term impacts are becoming quicker in cycle time and showing up more impactfully in terms of our day-to-day lives. Transportation is always the silent but critical connector in the response to that, until we run out of toilet paper and then people remember that we exist. Much like Jacob's deck, I'm going to start with the takeaways and focus on these areas as we go through the material. The key points that I want to convey are that our industry needs effective partnerships to implement new technologies. The technologies are readily available and tested, but need real-world execution experience. Cost pressures preclude the majority of trucking industry from easily adopting unconventional technologies. It's easy to go get a truck. It's justifiable expenditure, but to go buy an autonomous truck, that's price prohibitive. And lastly, and reiterating the first point, industry, academia, innovators, and regulators need a progressive relationship to bridge that gap. We all work in our own little silo. We need to work together towards moving our industry forward. The other key point is that data is transforming our future. Having spent the last 15 years in the Alberta oil sands, I can tell you that even the folks that work in the oil industry describe data as the new oil. It's what's driving our world and making the critical decisions in our day-to-day lives. So I want to start with a SWOT analysis. I really went and collaborated with a few other industry leaders and said, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that are facing our industry today? What best describes the opportunities, and where are we excelling? So from the top, conventional technology hasn't changed. It's a strength because it means that our supply chain is reliable and resilient. When we need more horsepower, we add more horses. And that's much to the chagrin of futurists and future technology. But at the end of the day, it's the reality. Now, in saying we add more horses, we also add more emission systems. But vehicle safety and operator training has been a very strong focus. We have an abundance of data that's growing by the day. But again, that's one of our weaknesses because we aren't harnessing that data. It's not synthetic, it's not used to move us forward. We have easily synthesized historic data because of the transactionary nature of our businesses. And we have easily adaptable service models. One of the biggest successes, strengths, and challenges that we have is we have a myriad of success stories. What we're doing works. It might not be the most conventional, it might not be the most efficient, it might not be using leading edge technology, but at the end of the day, the product gets from point A to point B and ends up with a customer. Weaknesses of our industry. Crisis drives our industry's priorities. You know, and the recent events within the transportation industry in Canada really reflect on that. Look how we ended up with mandatory entry-level driver training. That's something that industry's been pushing for the last 10 to 15 years. However, it took a crisis to get that across the line. There's a disconnect with the need for data and technology evolution. We have limited future thinkers in operational roles. There's a very operationalized focus on business execution. 85% of our businesses are 5 trucks or fewer, yet 85% of our industry is 150 trucks or more. There's limited marriage between academia, innovation, and industry. We don't have an effective channel for evolution, and we don't have an effective channel for execution of new technologies in the day-to-day world. And lastly, the last 4 points can be summarized that third-party logistics providers have come in and entered the space between a customer and a transportation provider. So while we were already facing an eroding margin in terms of the profitability of the services we offer, there's now an additional party that's interfacing between our customer and the trucking companies. In addition to that, the liabilities of the services we offer are always carried by the trucking company themselves. The threats we face are economic uncertainty, especially underlined through COVID, significant workforce shortages, and that can be displayed through the overall average age of the commercial transportation industry being mid to early 50s. Compare that to the standard working group, which is late 30s to early 40s. That 10-year difference is a significant gap, significant. And unlike the rest of the workforce, it's not getting younger, it's getting older. Our customers are more price conscious than ever, which again puts downward pressure on margins and limits the ability for organizations to explore new technologies and invest in new technologies. And again, risk transfer and the accountability to the truck operator. The biggest threat we have is, much like most industries, it's the way we've always done it. We are not open arms adaptable to new technologies. The opportunities much align. We have data-driven decisions and efficiency models that can maximize the efficiency of our business. We need collaboration. We need issue-focused think tanks between the 3 parties: regulators, academia, and industry. We need a shared risk model within supply chain, so it's not just one company that's left holding the bucket at the end of the day. And forward-looking regulatory models that engage and encourage in evolution of technologies. One of the projects that I've had the pleasure of being involved in historically with one of my previous employers was bringing the first autonomous shuttle that carried passengers on a public roadway to Canada. The exciting piece about that was the execution operationalization of it. The hardest part, even though the deployments have happened across 20 other countries without incident, was getting through all the regulatory process to get it approved to operate in Canada. We have a necessary integration of inland hubs. Our global supply chains have stretched over the last 50 years. Year over year, more freight moves further and beyond traditional networks. The solutions are focused on the first 97% of the journey. And much like Jacob covered in his presentation, it's that last 3%, the final mile, is the disruptive frontier in how we do what we do. That's also the biggest barrier to success. The solutions are evolving. As much as Jacob covered the Starship Technologies robot as a futuristic item, it's active today. This is Sunnyvale, California, operating on one of the campuses of a high-tech company. Every building on that campus has a doggy door where they have food delivery using the robot. So employees don't congregate in a cafeteria, they put their order in online, it's put into the robot, it's delivered to the side of their desk. And there's literally a fleet of 50 to 70 of these running around the campus at any given time. It's an example that technology, while being communicated in concept, isn't just in concept, it's here today. And again, touching on the 3PL challenge. As solution providers, they've been brought in to address efficiencies. 3PL providers enter the chasm between a customer and an asset-based service provider. The additional partner at the table adds downward pressure on margin through promises of reductions in spend and efficiencies. In addition, 3PLs are notorious for aggregating data for transportation pricing and leveraging that analysis of customer demands. They continue to invest aggressively on technology to do it better. They have the capacity and the financial wherewithal to make that investment and are using it to maximize their opportunities. This is a piece out of C.H. Robinson news release last year where they announced $1 billion investment in technology. You might think 3PLs involved in large or global companies, 31% of their overall revenue comes from small business.
So, can I ask a question, Jude?
Absolutely, Giovanni.
So, because we're talking about, if you can just explain about this chasm or this gap, I believe, between in the 3PL context, between customer and service provider. Can you explain further what that gap is and how it can be narrowed somehow?
At the end of the day, that relationship used to be a business-to-business relationship. It used to be a trucking or transportation provider in a relationship with someone that needed goods shipped. The 3PL industry has taken a step into the middle of that B2B relationship and is now brokering those relationships, maximizing efficiency and taking the opportunity to intercept and control the financial viability of both sides of those relationships. That's the chasm they've entered.
Okay. So is that affecting somehow the margins of the trucking companies, or can you or otherwise is there something that the 3PLs are providing right now, a technology they are using that you might use at the transportation side?
Absolutely. And I truly think that that's the evolution. The more you see trucking companies entering that space, the more you see folks that are asset-based transportation companies moving into the 3PL model. Now look at Swift as an example. In the last 24 months, they went and reduced their fleet by 13%. They tripled their logistics and planning staff. They've seen an increase in activity, but they're better using their assets.
Okay. And just not to pass, we have a great friend here and collaborator, Peter Wallace. He just made a comment here that somehow the lack of coordination between academia and industry could be a two-way street. So sometimes the industry needs to support academic research also being more theoretical and practical. So I don't know if you take that as a fair comment or
entirely.
Yeah.
Giovanni, entirely, and it's an absolute two-way street that we need to foster that relationship from both sides.
Okay. So thanks, Peter, as well for this question. Okay. So I let you go on, Jude. Thank you.
Absolutely. I just want to highlight the evolution of safety through technology. You know, one of the biggest pieces that technology has been used for is quantifying and managing risk. This is no longer an industry where you hand a driver a set of keys on the first day of the month and then say, we'll see you in a month when you come back. We know where every vehicle is. We know what every employee is doing behind the wheel. More advanced companies, like you'll see in a few slides, have video feeds off every asset that they have in the field. The interesting piece when we start talking about the future and talking about potential risk is what a huge risk technology and the lack of adoption presents to our industry. When we look at the proportion of risk that exists in a business model, especially through transportation, it's the lack of a strategic direction and the lack of a strategic plan with a forward-facing direction. Whereas traditional risk models are primarily based on either operational or financial risk. Moving into the technology side within transportation, you know, we've had basic evolutions of commercial vehicles in our industry over the last 20 years. And believe it or not, here we are talking about autonomous vehicles, yet 24 years ago, we introduced slack adjusters, which meant we didn't have to manually adjust the brakes on a vehicle. The evolution that our industry has taken is huge, huge. Slack adjusters alone reduced commercial vehicle collisions by almost 20%, followed by anti-lock brakes, automatic transmissions, the aerodynamics of a vehicle, you know, the ergonomics of a vehicle, be it seatbelt design, in-cab controls, access and automation, visibility, the improvements in illumination and blind spot reductions. Just like you were speaking to earlier, Giovanni and Jacob, around the risk of vulnerable road users, there have been strides over the last 5 years in reducing blind spots and trying to create a safer interface between commercial vehicles and the vulnerable sectors that we share roadways with. And then to highlight a few of the technologies reducing commercial vehicle on-road risk. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a significant upswing in in-vehicle mentoring systems. So really looking at the driver behavior side of the equation for on-road risk and safety, where it allows an employer to capture behind the wheel performance, provide immediate coaching to the employee to correct an undesired behavior. 97% of commercial vehicle collisions have a behavioral component attached to it that could have either prevented or lessened the risk of that event, lessened the severity of that event. Most commercial trucks today have the option of inclusion of ADAS technologies, adaptive cruise emergency braking, electronic stability control systems, lane departure warnings. And then from an optional perspective, we have electronic logging devices, which will be mandatory next summer, fatigue monitoring systems, and again, overall vehicle automation. The standard piece with commercial transportation is that through the development and engineering, based on the sheer volume, passenger vehicles can advance a lot faster, a lot more cost effectively than a commercial truck does. Commercial trucks do not have the consumer market available to recoup the engineering cost to stay on the forefront of the technology that exists. And then if you want to take it to another extreme, when you look at the commercial motor coach or bus market, they sell 1,000 buses a year in North America. To be able to re-engineer a bus every year or 2 years as new technology evolves, that's price prohibitive, cost prohibitive, and an extreme limitation on what's available in the market. You know, covering off the ELDs for folks that aren't in commercial trucking, we've had a history of fatigue management through paper logs. And when talking to some of the older truckers that are out on the road these days, it used to be called the creative writing exercise of the day, where an electronic log takes the manual process off. If you look down on the lower right portion of the screen, all an employee does is indicate whether they're on duty, off duty, and then the vehicle takes it from there as to whether they're driving or not driving. It's an exciting step forward, one that was mandated in the US a few years ago. It's mandated in Canada starting in July next year. Rosno, we took a step forward with technology. So we've equipped our vehicles with ELDs, with forward-facing cameras, and a number of ADAS platforms as well, as a risk mitigation platform. I think this is one of the exciting quotes that's floating around out there. You can't allow tradition to get in the way of innovation. There's a need to respect the past, but it's a mistake to revere the past. And it's one that's led Disney to explore new territory and grow to be a world of happiness around the world. But I think that type of approach is something that a lot of industries could learn from. One of the other pieces of technology that's heavily utilized within commercial transportation is a transportation management system. At Rosno, we use a TMS to track all interface with our employees, integrated for pickup, delivery, dispatch, dock management. It feeds all of that into our back end and has automated a lot of back office functions in our business. Again, looking at the demographics in our industry and saying that 85% of businesses in our industry are 1 to 5 trucks, that speaks to the challenge of organizations moving forward with adopting technology that would offer that edge on efficiency, that edge on customer management. So what next? Industry needs to evolve. When looking at the evolution of work, we've gone from a top-down hierarchy, 9 to 5 hours, working in an office, hoarded information and access controls, to working from anywhere, flexible hours, flattened structure. Folks look at this and say, this sounds good. You probably work in California, but that's what our world needs to evolve to attract a younger workforce, to provide resiliency to what we do. You know, how many companies hadn't thought about working remotely prior to COVID, and then were able to flip the switch so quickly just based on access to technology to transform their workplace into a remote work site. We need to tackle the challenges that are here today. Costs are up and rates are down. We have an extreme focus on safety, training, and risk mitigation. Risk distribution needs to be throughout a supply chain. Right now, within the general sector of commercial trucking, we've seen insurance rates go up 30 to 50% on average across the board within our industry, based on litigation in the US, based on some experience in Canada. We need to balance that throughout, not just our industry absorbing it, but our customers and our pricing and the technology that we're bringing into the industry. We have an impending workforce shortage on our doorstep. We need to make investment in practical new technology and have a collaborative use of big data. We also need to work on collaboration within our industry to improve load factors and efficiency. Having 3 and 4 trucks drive beside each other up the same piece of road half empty just doesn't make sense anymore. If you look at the stats on the right-hand side of the screen, that's from a group called Trucking HR Canada. And those are some details about the labor market in Canada within the trucking sector. When you look at the fact that we've currently got 8% open available driving positions, the economic impact from those positions is huge. We're talking tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in additional cost borne, either through overtime, through inefficiencies, through late deliveries, because of a lack of workforce. As an industry, we need to embrace the future. The situation we're in isn't a surprise. We need to think outside the box and embrace collaborative solutions. Collaboration between companies and between academia is limited but improving. And much to Peter's comment, the opportunities are there. We all need to come up with that middle ground where we can sit around and look at what the future holds for us. Transportation networks, in a conventional standpoint, are at capacity or nearing capacity. Look at the grain backlogs through the rail networks. Look at the conflict between, do we move Canadian oil or do we move Canadian grain? And if we pick one or the other, what's the impact, the financial impact and the economic impact? Transportation management systems load aggregation can drive efficiency and does. We're referencing the SWIFT example, a 13% vehicle reduction, all through increasing their planning departments. We need to focus on last mile solutions that drive a revolution in how transportation models operate. And that's not just from freight perspective, that includes passenger traffic and other vehicles. The regulatory environments. New technology has significant opportunity to improve safety, cost, and operational efficiencies. V2I, V2V, V2X, platooning, and autonomy is here today. It's not some new age theory. It exists. Our industry has traditionally been left addressing regulatory acceptance prior to implementation. That process needs to move further up the chain so that when the technology is developed, the regulatory acceptance occurs, not when an industry member wants to introduce or implement a technology, the regulator comes to the table at that point. Viable solutions need to be embraced and adopted jointly between all parties involved, specifically connected vehicles and autonomous vehicle technologies. The biggest point is we need to change our approach to transportation. Going back to the video that we started with, looking at where transportation sits in this whole sector, everything except for consumer interaction is lagging.
Once upon a time, business as usual was often good enough. No more. Where we are going, good enough is dead. In a world where everything is connected, where everything is equally excellent, where performance is reaching perfection, there's only one space left to innovate in: you. Right now, you are a central point in the raging tornado of change fueled by digitization, mobilization, augmentation, disintermediation, automation. Well, the list goes on. Science fiction is becoming science fact. Think about self-driving cars or computers that can learn and think. The way we work will never be the same. The skills we need will be dramatically different. Winning or losing are now happening faster than ever before. So what's your response? How will you discover new opportunities in one of the most transformational times in human history? Are you driving change, or are you being driven by it? Disruption has become the new normal. With change, it's always gradually, then suddenly, well, things really have stopped happening gradually. This change is exponential. Everything that used to be dumb and disconnected is now wired and intelligent. Cars, cities, ports, farms, even our bodies will be wired with sensors and will talk to each other. These game changers are also combinatorial. They amplify each other, creating a perfect storm of change. Quantum computing fuels big data. The Internet of Things fuels artificial intelligence and deep learning, which fuels robotics. However, anything that cannot be digitized or automated will become extremely valuable. Human-only traits such as creativity, imagination, intuition, emotion, and ethics will be even more important in the future, because machines are very good at simulating, but not at being. Yes, robots and software will do some of our work, but this will allow us to focus on things that cannot be automated. To imagine change squared, you've got to start engaging more with what might be, not just with what is. Immerse yourself in the immediate future, 5 to 7 years out from today. We need to go beyond technology and data to reach human insights and wisdom. Technology represents the how of change, but humans represent the why. The future is about holistic business model. The opportunity is to be liquid, to learn just in time, not just in case, not single improvements, but complete transformations, not individual systems, but new ecosystems. Humanity is where true and lasting value is created. We will engage, relate, and buy things because of the experiences they provide, because of their transformative power. The future doesn't just happen, the future gets happened. The new way to work is to embrace technology, but not to become it. The future is in technology, yet the bigger future lies in transcending it. Let's live and lead from here.
It's an exciting place we're in. We're really at the crossroads of what was. We have a vision for what is, and we're designing what will be. Well, again, to reiterate the takeaways, our industry needs effective partners to implement new technology. The technologies are available and tested, but have limited practical implementations today. We need to address cost pressures, and we need to come up with a model that allows technology to be adopted effectively throughout an industry, not just in the top 2%. And lastly, industry, academia, and innovators need progressive relationships to bridge the gap. With that, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'll turn it back to Cindy and Giovanni.
Thank you very much, Jude. Greatly appreciated. There was a lot of information and a lot of, I'm sure, people thinking out there as to what they're going to want to consider and look 10 years out. I'm looking at the time, and to be efficient, what we're going to do is we're actually not going to take a break. However, we are going to offer Jude a few moments if he'd like to, if he needs to take a break. And we are going to go right into the Q&A for the that were presented to us before and during this the presentations. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to submit, this would be the time. But what we're going to do is we're going to start with some questions immediately, going back to some of the presentations, and then we will bring in questions that the audience brings in as well. So I'm going to let Giovanni start off, and then we will just do a back and forth.
And we have just a question here from Brandon Choi. I think it's an easy or interesting or obvious question, I'd say. to Jude. What is Rosenau and other trucking companies doing to increase their efficiencies and improve their margins?
And again, it's one of those challenges of this year called 2020, because I don't think anyone had a crystal ball to look into what this is. From an operational perspective, I can tell you that most trucking companies that exist today, and most definitely the ones that will exist tomorrow, have really had a soul-searching focus on being innovative in terms of delivery of service and operational models. You know, looking inside just to create an efficient environment to provide the service that we have today through conventional models. The challenge again is looking on the forefront and saying, how do you deliver a conventional model today and evolve and make that necessary investment into the future technologies that are here but aren't necessarily proven?
I'm going to do an add-on question to that. And this actually brings in both Jacob and Jude on this one. So it's one thing to sort of take a look at that integration of data and having that soul searching. But what in terms of the products or that's out there and the availability for the cost, accessibility to those that are producing the technology, sort of that communication, because there's a lot of people within the trucking industry, and Jude and I would know this from having sort of been more directly, is that there's not only necessarily resistance, but an uncertainty and almost an anxiety of having that conversation with the academia. Yes, it's a two-way street, but it's an industry that seems very, I'm not sure, can we have that conversation, but there's a great need. In that knowledge of knowing there is such a critical necessity for technology, how do you see the academia industry collaboration going beyond this sort of presentation? Who wants to start off with that? Jacob, you're just going to unmute yourself there.
Yeah, sure. I was just not sure who's going to answer first. So yeah, I'll happily go. Beyond things like just this webinar, the first thing that comes to mind, because I'm involved with this integrated infrastructure for sustainable cities, is that there are funding programs from like the national fund, the federal, like NSERC, and other ones provincially, that encourage things like internships or research collaborations. So we are actively being encouraged by like our funding sources to go out and do this. So there is certainly motivation from our side. And a lot of those project proposals will then require to really demonstrate that it's, you know, adding benefits, economic benefits and technology benefit, and really addressing something of need and something of interest to a company. Other sort of opportunities to collaborate, I would maybe say simple like research collaborations where as academics, we sometimes don't know the real research questions. That's half the battle, is identifying the question. And once you've got it, you can go and find your answers. Whereas industry have those questions all the time. So I think simply just asking the questions and transferring that can be interesting, and yeah, produce really kind of good jointly directed work. I'll pass on to Jude for some other insight into that.
I think just to add to that, you know, there's some good initiatives that are looking to bridge that gap. I think we just need to, as both academia and industry and the regulatory world, take a big step forward beyond what we're at today. You know, groups like ACAMP, groups like the Alberta Aerospace Technology Center are immensely positive movements towards a collaborative relationship, but they're undervalued and underutilized.
Yeah. I would add into that, you've given me the thought about kind of conferences that during my 10 years as a PhD student right now, I found really good knowledge from attending conferences that were non-academic. And that's something I think more unusual, and I think is becoming more encouraged in academia and I hope in industry to attend these sort of joint conferences to facilitate those conversations. And a lot of those are local as well, have been hosted in Calgary.
Probably would be the same for the transportation side. I know from people that I've communicated with, there's not a lot of the people in the transportation side that actually go to the academic technology, those high level, high scope, because they just think they won't understand, where I think they've misled themselves to realize that they actually do know more than they realize. As the user, you demand the question of what you want. You step forward. You don't have to wait for someone to bring it to you. You need to go tell them what you want. And that's a lesson I think that needs to be learned.
Absolutely.
So we have another question coming here, and maybe I will have to ask both Jude and Jacob. That is one of the elephants in the room. So the province of Alberta has this status of Western Canada's distribution hub. So do you believe that, are you prepared to maintain that status? What investments in infrastructure would be necessary? Has any level of government taken an honest look at those investments? So what does it take to maintain and even expand on that status in the future? So if could both Jude and Jacob think about that.
And again, I think that goes back to the comment earlier that we need a collaborative, cohesive relationship between the regulator, industry, and academia. You know, the focus is we need to sit in a safe space and start to map out what the future looks like, and create as opposed to letting it be for us.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment. And sorry, Giovanni, you cut off me for a second. Did you say inland ports? Is that what the question was about?
No, it's called the province of Alberta called the Western Canada's distribution hub.
Oh, okay.
So it's
yes,
something that's been achieved over time because of our location, because of our infrastructure. So, and the question is whether we are well positioned at making the investments that are necessary to keep that status in the future, or maybe if we be lagging. So, what's your view about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that certainly makes me think about the Calgary's municipal goods movement strategy, identifying Calgary as wanting to be an inland hub. An anecdote I seem to remember from that was that I think it was Home Depot or one of these home hardware companies, rather than having space in Vancouver to do their like repackaging and reconsolidation work, they actually just shipped everything straight to Calgary because of the cheaper land costs and cheaper labor costs, and then were able to then did all their unpacking of their container ships and then repackaged them and sometimes sent them back to Vancouver. So sometimes there are just like logistical advantages with like those price points, and I think that's what's always going to drive that is price and also connectivity. The reason that's possible is because we have that really good roads and rail link to Vancouver. And I think Alberta as a province, I think there's the two highways that kind of split, I believe, if I know my geography correctly, like in Saskatchewan. So we have access to both like Prince Rupert and Vancouver as ports to then do a similar thing to both Edmonton and Calgary. So I think Alberta is quite well situated to be that inland port gateway from like Asia, for example, from the Asian markets, and doing similar things, but for air freight. Why would you bother landing in Vancouver when you can just fly a little hour extra and land in Calgary and get those, warehousing and logistics advantages?
Okay.
Yeah, and there's also the north-south aspect too. Alberta's in a really strong situation and a lot of opportunities there. I wanted to ask, in terms of both, when you guys are looking at the technology design and adaptation and the trucking industry in terms of a manpower shortage, well, do you think that the technology will not looking at the last video in terms of change and technology taking over sort of those mundane and those the physical things that we say that we don't want to do as humans, and we want to be critical and creative thinkers. But in the short term, let's say 10 years, do you feel that technology is going to be to an advantage for hiring? Is it something that will have value added? And is it something that is being looked at as how do we actually participate in bringing it forward to grow the industry, get that collaboration and interest in a newer generation to enter?
Cindy, I think there's a balance, and I really look at the technology that's here today as addressing those behavioral sides of driving, the coaching end of it, and working on that human machine interface. The piece where the industry has gone in terms of mandatory entry-level driver training and the focus on industry image and recruitment is going to address the workforce gap as long as we change the image of the industry to attract a younger worker. The safeguards with advanced technology are going to support the ability of that younger worker to be behind the wheel. Not necessarily going to say with less experience than less training, but in a safer atmosphere. Hey, Cindy, you're on mute.
So question here from Guilherme Gramari, and I think that maybe the next question is good. What impacts in demand the job market do you believe are going to happen, and do you believe those changes will be permanent?
And Giovanni, I think it's too early to tell. The slide that Jacob had around the progression of autonomous vehicles is indicative of the future. We will still have safety drivers for the foreseeable future behind the wheel of any autonomous vehicle that's out and about. At the end of the day, when you look at the investment in trucks, there are still 15 to 20-year-old trucks that are entirely safe on the road today. So when we look at that 7 to 8 year window before we get to a point where technology is reliable enough to operate itself, we're still looking at 20 years of equipment that's on the road, that's purpose, that's a tangible operating asset in terms of that window of what represents the commercial transportation industry in terms of vehicle utilization.
I would also like to add about the idea of what I would call kind of like the Uberification of last mile or trucking. I think of Amazon as an example. I've been using them a little bit too much maybe, but they gave like an incentive program to their employees where I believe they gave like a $10,000 like seed funding investment, like guaranteed, if they would basically make themselves an owner operator for their last mile distribution systems with, I believe, even electric vehicles. So on one hand, that's pushing for good, but on the other hand, there are all these kind of societal and employment issues of pushing towards this gig economy, which has, they're transferring liability, and that's how they're trying to achieve that cost lowering. And it's trying to avoid that risk, which, people, particularly given the current change with the pandemic and the economy, might be more willing to take those risks and put themselves in more difficult positions. We see the same thing with the rise of like apps like Skip the Dishes, where people moving into that and making those decisions aren't thinking about the whole system costs, and are then kind of being taken advantage because of it. Whereas I think trucking, which has always had a tradition of kind of owner operating, has got a lot of experience in that and still doing this well without avoiding all of these kind of ethical issues. So I think we can take lessons from the history of trucking owner operators, to make a better future for that and avoid some of those pitfalls that other industries will have for this gig economy.
I've got a couple of quick questions. The first one, this is not, you don't have to go through the entire program of what you discussed, but pick something that you think of. What prior to the pandemic would have made a significant improvement for trucking through the pandemic, and do you think it'll be adopted?
I'll start with a completely basic one while Jacob's thinking. Through the pandemic, we shut everything down. We shut down restaurants, we shut down service stations, we shut down stops on the side of the road. And then we talked about the fragility of our supply chain and forgot that the person behind the wheel of a car needs a washroom, needs food, needs somewhere to stop. And it really has turned the spotlight on just how intricate the support services of a transportation network are to the resilience of our supply chain.
So sometimes what we need isn't necessarily straight technology, but utilizing maybe some tools to help what we need in terms of the structural support. What about you,
And,
Jacob? Oh, sorry.
And the interconnectedness of all of those functions.
Yeah, for sure. Jacob?
No, I would kind of agree with Jude that, and I'm trying to, a little bit of the point of my presentation as well is that thinking about these new technologies sometimes reveals problems just in that can be solved with our everyday systems that we might have forgotten about. And as Jude said, we forgot that truckers need washrooms and restaurants and such, which, you know, was a terrible tragedy, right, for that time. Thankfully, it was addressed quickly. I also like to think that, you know, people make that criticism that during the pandemic, oh, you know, it's revealed the inefficiencies or the problems with trucking. I think it's the opposite, that almost by definition, an incredibly efficient system has no fat, right? There's no slack. So when it's hit by a shock, it's necessarily going to have great difficulty because it's highly adapted to its standard operating environment. It's incredibly efficient. So there's this constant trade-off between efficiency and reliability, or that like resistance to shock, that you know, that sort of decision making might continue into the future, and we might see a technically less efficient network. But if these technologies that are enabling, you know, consolidating of, you know, different carriers or items into a truck, and that sort of other sort of sharing ideas enabled by this technology, then that can still be resistant yet be efficient.
Good. No, thank you very much. One last question, and then we're going to wrap it up because we have come to our time. We actually did it all pretty well, except no one got a break. What is your, in each of you, and it can be any aspect that you've been involved in or see, what is your vision or idea of success in trucking? This is your creative, this is where that creativity, the human capacity.
I think it's creating a more open, accessible, and relationship-based development chain for implementation of technology. You know, not having the Too Simples of the world or the Waymos of the world off creating their own truck and their own little test bed, but coming to industry, coming to academia to say, what do we need to do to solve the problem? What is the problem and how can we fix it together?
Yeah, you can build whatever you want, but if nobody's going to buy it, it doesn't matter.
Cindy, that's exactly it. And most importantly, and one of the biggest hurdles is once we make that perfect mousetrap, at the end of the day, having the regulator through the process so that once it's developed, it isn't a whole nother evolution of cycle to bring it to market to be able to use.
Perfect. Jacob?
I would echo that statement. I would say, reflecting on my slides a little bit about that, a big company such as Waymo or these big companies who are wanting to have their own way with things, they don't know everything, right? As shown with those hacking of Amazon boxes horribly into a giant truck, causing them problems. You know, they're not experienced in and to know these like basic, what we consider kind of basic principles of logistics. Similarly, they're, because of their sheer size, they're going to tend to then drive the standards and regulations, whereas standards and regulations really kind of should go the other way, like Jude's saying, and should be a force to enable healthy competition and a healthy market that's going to benefit the end customer and really benefit the players in that space anyway. Healthy regulations will drive that healthy competition. And then for a slightly different tone out, I like to think about the externalities that are imposed upon society by the trucking industry. We've touched briefly about vulnerable road users, and why are trucks having to encroach into the city? It's because of this drive for cost over everything, but having other systems like a slightly different supply chain with these like urban consolidation or different steps, then different modes can be used that are then safer for the public and emit less carbon dioxide and such, and also better for the drivers. I remember seeing a driver talk on one of these autonomous vehicle news pieces, and he said that, yeah, one of the worst parts of the job is having to be away for weeks at a time from your family. And how are you going to get people in is you're going to tell them, well, actually what your job is to go to the outskirts of the city and bring the truck in, and then do that a few times a day. And then the autonomy can focus on that middle mile, that kind of consolidation step that I discussed. And that benefits everybody as long as we're focusing on improving the kind of experience, both the customer's experience, our local community's experience, and the driver's experience.
Yeah, my experience with large companies has been that they sometimes move like a train. The engine is taking off, but the caboose doesn't know what's going on yet until it gets pulled. But by the time the engine realizes that they made a really bad decision, it takes quite a while for the caboose to know. So now that's old school. Nowadays they got it down to a technology and it's immediate, but just using that old statement. So sometimes they can push through. It's no different than saying that NASA really created a lot of our technology. You need that large scope. It's the collaboration outside. They've made the mistakes. What can we learn and benefit from? And we also have to there's an issue of ethics right there, I would think. Everyone has these needs. Are we ethically sourcing and sharing them, right? So Giovanni, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap it up? And
no, just thank everyone, thanking our two great speakers, and also your work as moderator, and then particularly your attendee. It was a very good session, so thank you so much.
No, for sure. Thank you very much, everybody that did stick it out with us. And we want to thank our presenters and Giovanni for participating. And if you have any questions that you want to follow up on, the emails are on the shared screen that you can see. And we will reach out to people if we pull together the video and correct my mic problem. But again, thank you very much, everybody, for the evening. It was, I really enjoyed it, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Take care. Thank you.
Yeah.